To understand anything about ancient Egypt, one must first understand the river. Not as a dramatic entity, not as a god, though it would become one, but as a slow, vast, and profoundly predictable meteorological and geological event. The story of the pyramids, of the pharaohs, of the civilization itself, begins not with a king's decree, but with the annual, somnolent pulse of water and silt. It is a story of repetition, of a rhythm so dependable it became the very heartbeat of a culture, and the foundation upon which impossible stone mountains would eventually be raised. So, let us begin at the true beginning with the inundation, the Ake. Each year, far to the south, in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia, the summer monsoon rains would begin. This was a distant, unseen phenomenon to the Egyptians of the Nile Valley. They would not witness the clouds gathering over the Ethiopian plateau, nor the first drops hitting the baked earth. They would only experience the consequence, arriving with a stately, ponderous delay. The Blue Nile and the Atbara rivers, swollen with runoff, would surge northward, carrying not just water, but the key to life itself, sediment. This sediment was not ordinary dirt. It was a rich, mineral-laden silt, eroded from the volcanic basalt of the highlands over millennia, a thick, dark, and supremely fertile mud. Meanwhile, in the Central African Lake region, the White Nile, fed by steady equatorial rains, provided a more constant, gentle flow. The two Niles converged at Khartoum, their waters mingling, and this combined force would then begin its long, northward journey through the desert. The floodwaters would first appear in Egypt at Aswan, typically in early July. The rise was not a violent, crashing wave, but a gradual, inexorable swelling. Day by day, the river would creep up its banks. The Nile Valley, a narrow green ribbon rarely more than a few miles wide, flanked by the Eye. Chapter 2. The Paleolithic Foundations of the Nile Valley. Before the pharaohs, before the first village, before even the predictable rhythm of the Nile's flood could be named and worshipped, there was the stone, and the sand, and a climate that was not a constant, but a slow, grinding variable over epochs so vast they render dynasties and even pyramids into mere momentary flickers. To trace the origins of the pyramid-building civilization, one must look past the mud-brick mastabas and the royal annals, past even the first agricultural experiments, and into the deep, resonant silence of the Paleolithic. This is the true foundation, not built by human hands, but laid down by geological forces and inhabited, seasonally, ephemerally, by small bands of humans whose entire world was dictated by the availability of flint nodules and the migratory paths of animals long since vanished from the earth. The story begins not along the lush ribbon of the Nile we know, but in a landscape that was often unrecognizable. During the Pleistocene epoch, which spanned from about 2.6 million years ago to roughly 11,700 years ago, the Sahara Desert was not the arid barrier we see today. It underwent dramatic climatic oscillations, cycling through pluvial periods, times of increased rainfall, and hyperarid periods. During these wet phases, the Sahara was a savanna, dotted with lakes and crossed by networks of rivers. One of these, the so-called radar rivers detected beneath the modern sands by satellite imagery, may have been a major tributary system. The Nile itself was a different river, often comprising several separate, shifting channels across a much wider valley. It is within this fluctuating green Sahara that we find the earliest hints of human presence in the region. These were not Homo sapiens at first, but earlier hominins. Scattered, weathered stone tools, crude hand axes of the Acheulean tradition, have been found on ancient terraces high above the modern Nile floodplain. Chapter 3. The Badarian Culture's Pottery. In the long, slow narrative of the Nile Valley, after the immense, formless stretches of the Paleolithic, we arrive at the first clear signature of a distinct, settled people. It is not found in grand architecture or royal insignia, but in the fired clay of simple, hand-formed vessels. The Badarian culture, named for the site of El Badari in Upper Egypt, near the modern city of Asiut, emerges around 4,400 BCE and persists until approximately 4,000 BCE. It represents a quiet, almost tentative, transition. Here, the nomadic patterns of the deep past begin to solidify, like silt settling from muddy water, into something recognizable as a precursor to the Egyptian way of life. And the primary medium through which we understand this quiet revolution is its pottery. The Badarian culture did not suddenly appear in a vacuum. It evolved from the earlier Thasian and Neolithic traditions of the region, a gradual coalescence of practices in response to the continuing desiccation of the surrounding deserts. These people were still semi-nomadic to a degree, practicing a form of seasonal transhumance. They would likely plant crops along the Nile floodplain during the Parate season, following the retreating waters, and then move with their herds of sheep, goats, and cattle to the margins of the desert during the drier months, where seasonal grasses might sprout after rare rains. But compared to their Paleolithic ancestors, they were more anchored, more invested in specific locations along the river. Their settlements were likely small, seasonal clusters of reed or wattle and daub huts, leaving almost no trace for archaeologists. What they left behind in their graves was their pottery. The pottery of the Badarian culture is, in its technical and aesthetic qualities, a quiet masterpiece of early craftsmanship. It marks a significant technological and cognitive leap. This was not sun-dried mud, but intentionally fired clay, a process that REQ. Chapter 4. The Naqada Period, Gradual Social Stratification. The Naqada period, spanning from approximately 4000 BCE to 3000 BCE, is not an event, but a process. It is a slow, almost imperceptible thickening of the social fabric, a deepening of the cultural patterns first glimpsed in the Badarian graves. Named for the large site of Naqada in Upper Egypt, this millennium-long stretch of time witnesses the transformation of semi-nomadic, egalitarian farming communities into proto-urban centers ruled by nascent elites, the direct political and social precursors to the pharaonic state. It is a story best told not through battles or royal decrees, which leave no record, but through the silent, accumulating evidence of grave goods, settlement patterns, and the proliferation of symbols whose meanings were steadily coalescing into a shared language of power. Archaeologists divide the Naqada period into three main phases: Naqada I, Amratian, Naqada II, Gurzian, and Naqada III, Sumanian or Proto-Dynastic. Each phase represents a gradual intensification of trends, a societal pot slowly coming to a simmer. Naqada I, circa 4000 to 3500 BCE, continues many Badarian traditions but with notable expansions. Settlements remain small and largely ephemeral, but they become more numerous along the Nile. The pottery, while still including fine black-topped ware, diversifies. A new style emerges: white cross-lined pottery. These vessels, often beakers or bowls with rounded bases, are decorated with geometric patterns, zigzags, triangles, hatched squares, painted in a creamy white pigment onto a red-brown clay body. The patterns are simple, abstract, and seemingly regional, lacking a unified iconography. Yet, their very existence shows an increased investment in surface decoration, in marking an object with a design that transcends its function. It is a move from pure form to adorned form. The grave goods from this period begin to show more pronounced differentiation. While most burials are S. Chapter 5. A detailed look at the administrative significance of early maceheads. To understand the genesis of the pharaonic state, the administrative engine that would one day build pyramids, one must look not to grand declarations, but to the small, dense, and often overlooked artifacts that preceded writing. Among these, the ceremonial macehead stands as a particularly potent and silent witness. More than a weapon, and certainly more than a mere symbol of brute force, the early ceremonial macehead, especially from the late pre-dynastic and proto-dynastic periods, Naqada III, is a fossilized piece of bureaucracy. It encapsulates the transition from personal prowess to institutionalized authority, from raiding to taxation, and from local chieftaincy to kingship. Its significance is not in its capacity to crush a skull, but in its role in organizing the harvest, counting livestock, and marshaling labor. The mace itself is an ancient weapon, a simple club with a heavy stone head. In its utilitarian form, it was a tool of war and hunting. However, the ceremonial maceheads that survive, often carved from exquisite and fragile stones like limestone, alabaster, or even breccia, are something entirely different. They are too delicate for combat. Their surfaces are meticulously smoothed and shaped, And, most importantly, they are frequently decorated with raised relief carvings. It is in these carvings that their true administrative function is revealed. The most famous example, though not the earliest, is the scorpion macehead, discovered at Hierakonpolis and dated to the very end of the pre-dynastic period, circa 3100 BCE. It is a large, pear-shaped macehead of limestone, carved with a complex narrative scene. The central figure is a man wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt and a ritual bull's tail, identified by a rosette and a scorpion glyph as King Scorpion. He holds a hoe. He is not depicted in battle. He is not smiting an enemy. He is engaged in an act of profound sea. Chapter 6: King Narmer and the Mechanics of Bureaucratic Unification. The name Narmer resonates as the foundational act. He stands at the blurred threshold between myth and history, between the slow coalescence of the Naqada period and the stark administrative reality of Dynasty I. He is traditionally credited with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, the moment the two lands became one. But to view this as a single dramatic battle or decree is to miss the profound, mechanical truth of it. Narmer's unification was less a military conquest and more the final, bureaucratic integration of two already complex systems. It was the merging of ledger books, the standardization of tax codes, the imposition of a single administrative language across the Nile's long, fertile corridor. The evidence for this lies not in annals of battle, but on a single, dense artifact, the Narmer palette. The Narmer palette, a siltstone ceremonial object for grinding eye paint, is often treated as a triumphal monument, a political poster in stone. And indeed, its iconic imagery is compelling. On one side, the large figure of Narmer, wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt, grasping the hair of a kneeling captive, mace raised, poised to strike. Below him, two prone, naked figures, likely representing defeated enemies or towns. On the other side, Narmer, now wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt, marches in a ritual procession with standard-bearers to view a row of decapitated, bound corpses. The central, dominating image is of two long-necked serpopards, mythical beasts, their necks entwined, being controlled by attendants. This is the symbolic, declarative layer. The king as unifier and vanquisher of chaos. Yet, to read the palette only as propaganda is to overlook its meticulous, dry detail, which reveals the mechanics of the new state. Consider the register above the smiting scene. It contains a curious, detailed depiction. A rectangular building with a pitched roof, from which hangs AR. Chapter 7. The Early Dynastic Period. A list of royal names. With the symbolic and administrative groundwork laid by Narmer, Egyptian history enters its first formal, recorded phase. The Early Dynastic Period, encompassing dynasties 1 and 2, approximately 3000 to 2686 BCE. This is an era of consolidation, of making the mechanisms of unification permanent. The grand narratives of this time are largely lost, shrouded in the silt of millennia. What remains in stark, repetitive clarity are the names. The royal names of the early dynastic period are not just identifiers. They are administrative tokens, the foundational entries in the first ledger of the state. To list them is to trace the scaffolding upon which the edifice of pharaonic civilization was slowly, methodically, raised. The primary source for this list is the Palermo stone, a fragmentary black basalt slab inscribed during the 5th dynasty. It records, in dry, analytic style, the reigns of kings from the pre-dynastic period through the middle of Dynasty 5. For the earliest kings, the entries are terse: a name, a brief notation of a significant event, often the following of Horus, a biennial tax census, and the height of the Nile inundation for that year. It is the barest of bureaucratic outlines, a chronicle stripped of all drama, leaving only the rhythmic pulse of royal succession and annual measurement. Dynasty 1, circa 3000 to 2890 BCE, the kings of the first dynasty, buried in the elaborate underground tomb complexes at Abydos, represent the firm establishment of the Memphite state. Their names, many echoing animals or objects, hold meanings now obscure but which likely expressed aspects of royal power or divine affiliation. 1. Narmer, perhaps identical with Menes, the legendary unifier. 2. Hora-Ha, Horus the fighter. His name emphasizes the martial aspect of kingship. 3. Jur, meaning uncertain. 4. Jet, also known as Waji, meaning uncertain, possibly serpent of Horus. 5. Den, also known as Udimu. Chapter 8. The evolution of mudbrick tomb architecture at Abydos. Before the stone there was mud. Before the pyramid there was the pit. The monumental leap into eternity did not spring fully formed from the sands of Saqqara. It was the culmination of a slow, experimental evolution in burial practice, an evolution best traced not in the glitter of gold or the polish of granite, but in the humble, sun-dried mud brick. The sacred necropolis of Abydos, in Upper Egypt, serves as the quiet, sprawling laboratory for this evolution. Here, across the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, the tomb of a ruler transformed from a simple hole in the ground into a subterranean palace, a change that prefigured and perhaps even demanded the ultimate architectural statement of the pyramid. The journey begins not with kings, but with chieftains of the Naqada II period. Their graves at Abydos, like those elsewhere, were oval or rectangular pits dug into the desert gravel. The body was placed in a contracted position, wrapped in a mat or animal skin, and surrounded by pots and prized possessions. The only architectural element was the pit itself, a negation of earth. There was no lining, no marker. The desert reclaimed the space swiftly, leaving only a slight depression. The first significant architectural intervention appears in the late pre-dynastic Naqada III, with the tombs of Dynasty 0 rulers like Ayar-Wahor, Ka, and Scorpion. The pit becomes larger and more regular. Its walls are now sometimes lined with a single course of mud bricks, simple, hand-formed rectangles of Nile silt mixed with straw and dried in the sun. This is a crucial development. The mud brick lining does more than prevent wall collapse. It defines the space. It creates a clear, geometric boundary between the realm of the dead and the surrounding chaos of the earth. The tomb becomes a room, however rudimentary. These early brick-lined pits often featured a small niche at one
Chapter
end
9,
for grave goods, a technical description of the mastaba tomb form. Having traced the evolution of subterranean complexity at Abydos, we must now turn our attention skyward, or at least to the visible horizon, to the architectural form that bridged the hidden world of the pit and the aspiring geometry of the pyramid, the mastaba. The mastaba tomb is the essential, intermediate chapter in the story of monumental funerary architecture. It represents the moment when eternal housing for the elite shifted from being primarily a repository beneath the earth to being a persistent, functional structure upon it. To understand the pyramid, one must first dissect, in methodical detail, the standard components and the dry logic of the mastaba. The term mastaba is an Arabic word meaning bench, bestowed upon these structures millennia after their construction due to their resemblance to the low, mud brick benches found outside Egyptian village houses. This is apt, for the mastaba is, in its essence, a bench for the dead, a long, low, rectangular platform. Its form is not born from aesthetic whimsy, but from a series of pragmatic and ritualistic requirements that coalesced into a standardized architectural template during the early dynastic period, particularly at the necropolis of Saqqara. The superstructure, a geometric shell. The above-ground portion of a typical early dynastic mastaba is a solid, monolithic block. Its core is not constructed with careful masonry, but is comprised of rubble, desert gravel, sand, and limestone chips, dumped and compacted within a retaining skin. This skin, the outer casing, is made of mud brick, laid in regular courses, sometimes with slight inward batter, a slope, for stability. The exterior was likely plastered with a smooth layer of Nile mud, providing a uniform, blank facade. The dimensions vary, but a large noble's mastaba might be 30 meters long, 15 meters wide, and 4 to 6 meters high. Its shape is strictly rectilinear, its lines parallel to T. Chapter 10. The Step Pyramid. A methodical analysis of its layered construction. The step pyramid of King Necherkit-Djoser at Saqqara does not appear as a sudden, monolithic vision. It emerges, rather, through a series of cautious, incremental, and deeply logical architectural decisions. It is not a single building, but a cumulative process, a sedimentary record of ambition and revision captured in stone. To understand it is to peel back these layers, not as a tale of inspired genius, but as a slow, methodical sequence of problem-solving, where each new phase responds to the limitations and possibilities of the last. This is not the story of a pyramid, but the story of a tomb that became one, step by deliberate step. Phase 1. The Mastaba Foundation, M1. The project began conventionally. For his eternal house, Djoser's architect, Imhotep, initially planned a grand but traditional structure, a massive square mastaba. This first structure, referred to by archaeologists as M1, was centered over a deep, limestone-lined burial shaft dug 28 meters into the bedrock. The mastaba itself was a solid mass, approximately 63 meters on each side and roughly 8 meters high. Its core was of rough, locally quarried limestone rubble, and its outer casing was of fine, high-quality Tura limestone, laid in courses that sloped slightly inward, mimicking the mud brick construction methods with which builders were intimately familiar. This was a mastaba, but executed in stone on a colossal scale, a significant innovation in material but not yet in form. It already declared a shift in permanence from mud brick to stone, but its footprint and profile were rooted in established tradition. The burial apartments below were extensive, a labyrinth of corridors and galleries for the king's burial and the storage of thousands of stone vessels, but they were accessed only from the vertical shaft, sealing them off after interment. Phase 2. The rectangular Chapter expansion,
11.
M2, the reign of Djoser, before M1
primarily
was even
known
completed
from
inscriptions. Our understanding of Netrikit Djoser, the king for whom the step pyramid was built, is a study in echoes and implications. He stands as a monumental figure in Egyptian history, yet he himself is curiously insubstantial in the traditional narrative sense. No vivid tales of his conquests survive, no detailed accounts of his court. His reign is not illuminated by the drama of biography, but is instead circumscribed by the quiet, formal language of administrative and religious inscriptions. To know Djoser is not to know a man, but to observe the shadow cast by a vast, bureaucratic machine as it performed its functions under the authority of his name. The primary contemporary sources for his reign are a collection of stone vessels, seal impressions, and a single, significant boundary stela. These are not historical texts. They are records of ownership, dedication, and domain. From these dry fragments, a profile emerges not of a personality, but of a kingship that had achieved a new level of institutional permanence and geographic reach. The famine stela, a later reflection. It is instructive to begin with what isn't a contemporary source. The so-called famine stela, carved on a granite outcraft on Sihel Island at Aswan over 2 millennia after Djoser's death, during the Ptolemaic period. It purports to be a decree of Djoser, concerned with a 7-year famine and his consultation with the god Khnum. While historically unreliable for the Old Kingdom, the very existence of this text is a profound testament to Djoser's enduring legacy. By the late period, his name was synonymous with ancient, pious kingship and effective administration in times of crisis. He had become an archetype, a useful figure from the distant past to whom later generations could attribute wisdom and action. This tells us that his memory was preserved not for specific deeds, but for the aura of his era, the era when stone monumental. Chapter 12. Sekhemket's Unfinished Pyramid. An inventory of site findings. Following the monumental achievement of Djoser's complex, the immediate successor's ambition is palpable, yet it manifests as a haunting negative space, a blueprint interrupted. The pyramid attributed to Sekhemket, Djoser's probable successor, located a short distance southwest of the step pyramid at Saqqara, stands as one of Egyptian archaeology's most eloquent testaments to failure, process, and the fragile contingencies that underpin even the most determined plans. It was never completed, likely abandoned in the early stages of its construction. Consequently, it offers not a polished monument, but a raw, fossilized cross-section of the pyramid-building endeavor in medias res. The significance lies not in what was achieved, but in what was left behind. An inventory of site findings that reads like a paused sentence in the language of state enterprise. The discovery and the empty sarcophagus. The site was discovered in 1951 by the Egyptian archaeologist Zakaria Goniam. Excavations revealed the rough outline of a pyramid base, approximately 120 meters square, slightly larger than Djoser's initial footprint. The structure had only progressed to a height of a few courses of stone, barely rising above its foundation trenches before work ceased. The most dramatic find lay within. A descending corridor similar to Djozer's led to an unfinished but extensive subterranean gallery system. At the end of a tunnel, excavators found a sealed, beautifully crafted alabaster sarcophagus of exquisite workmanship. The anticipation was immense. When the heavy lid was painstakingly raised, it revealed a nothing. The sarcophagus was utterly empty. There was no body, no grave goods, not even a fragment of organic material. This void is the site's central mystery and its most profound finding. A costly vessel prepared for a king who was never placed within it. The material inventory, a snapshot of abandonment. Chapter 13. The geological composition of the Saqqara Plateau. The decision to build at Saqqara, first for the great mastaba fields and then for Djozer's revolutionary complex, was not an arbitrary one. It was a choice dictated by the cold, silent logic of geology. The Saqqara Plateau is not a featureless desert plain. It is a specific geological formation whose characteristics provided the essential raw materials and stable foundation required for monumental stone construction. To understand why the Pyramid Age begins here, one must understand the bedrock itself. The plateau is part of the Mokattam Formation, a vast geological unit composed primarily of sedimentary limestone deposited during the Eocene epoch, approximately 56 to 34 million years ago. This limestone is not uniform. It is stratified into distinct layers, or beds, each with unique properties that ancient builders learned to recognize and utilize with increasing sophistication. The key strata, a builder's catalog. 1. The foundation, the basal bed. Directly beneath the desert sand and surface rubble lies a thick layer of hard, crystalline limestone. This stone is dense, resistant to erosion, and forms a remarkably stable foundation. It was into this layer that the builders excavated the vast, deep burial shafts and subterranean galleries for the mastabas and early pyramids. Its solidity prevented collapse and provided a secure anchor for the immense weight of the structures above. This stratum was the literal bedrock of the necropolis. 2. The core material, the shale and marl interbeds. Within the limestone sequence are softer layers of shale and marly limestone. These were less useful for building but played a crucial role. They often served as natural floors or ceilings within the quarries, allowing workers to separate blocks along these planes of weakness. The variable hardness also meant that quarrying could be focused on the more desirable limestone beds, using the softer layers as natural glue. Chapter 14. The transition to the true pyramid form, a structural debate. The leap from the stepped silhouette of Djozer's monument to the smooth, classical geometry of the 4th Dynasty pyramids at Giza represents one of the most consequential transitions in architectural history. This was not merely an aesthetic preference for a cleaner line. It was a profound shift in symbolic intent and structural engineering. The debate surrounding this transition is not about a single eureka moment, but a slow convergence of religious ideology, architectural confidence, and practical problem-solving, likely spanning the reigns of several 3rd Dynasty kings after Djoser. The evidence is fragmentary, and the process was almost certainly one of iterative experiment, marked by both ambition and setback. The symbolic imperative, from stairway to sun ray. The step pyramid's form is fundamentally additive and terrestrial. It is a staircase, a means of ascent, tier by tier. Its symbolism is one of progression, of climbing toward the stars or the primeval mound. The true pyramid form, with its unbroken, planar faces converging at a single apex, embodies a different and more potent solar theology. By the early 4th Dynasty, the cult of the sun god Ra was attaining supremacy, centered at the nearby city of Heliopolis. The pyramid came to be seen as a petrified ray of the sun, a ramp upon which the dead king would ascend directly to join the solar bark of Ra. The smooth casing stones, often polished to a high sheen and sometimes capped with electrum or gold, would have mirrored the sun's brilliance, making the structure a colossal, gleaming beacon. This shift from a stellar to a solar orientation demanded a form that was seamless, radiant, and directional, pointing inexorably from Earth to heaven. The engineering challenge, the problem of the step. From a structural perspective, the stepped form, while stable, has inherent weaknesses. The corners of each step are vulnerable points where arrow. Chapter 15. Snefru's first pyramid at Meidum. A slow structural collapse. The pyramid at Meidum stands as a solitary, broken sentinel on the edge of the Fayum oasis, its form more a jagged geological outcrop than a deliberate monument. It is often called the collapsed pyramid, but this term is misleading. Its failure was not a sudden, catastrophic event, but a slow, inexorable process of structural compromise, a gradual surrender to gravity and flawed engineering. This pyramid, likely begun by Snefru's third dynasty predecessor Huni but completed or adopted by Snefru himself, represents the first major attempt to realize the ideal of the true, smooth-sided pyramid. Its ruin is the most eloquent testimony to the immense technical challenges of that transition, a silent lecture in the physics of failure. Initial form and ambition. Originally, Meidum was conceived as a step pyramid, probably comprising 7 or 8 distinct tiers, built using the traditional accretion layer method. This core, rising at a steep angle, was stable in its own right. The revolutionary ambition came in the second building phase, attributed to Snefru. The decision was made to transform the stepped core into a true, smooth-sided pyramid, a geometrical pyramid. To achieve this, workers filled in the steps with horizontal layers of local limestone blocks, creating a smooth, outer mantle. Finally, this rough outer packing was itself cased in fine Tura limestone, polished to a gleaming finish. When completed, it would have risen to a height of approximately 92 meters at a very steep angle of 51 degrees 50 minutes, a sharp, dramatic silhouette against the sky. The mechanics of the collapse. The collapse was not an instantaneous toppling. Evidence suggests it was a protracted, granular failure that likely occurred over centuries, even millennia, after its construction. The process can be reconstructed from the pyramid's current state and the debris fields surrounding it. 1. The weak interface, the fundament. Chapter 16. The bent pyramid. A pragmatic adjustment of angles. The bent pyramid at Dashur is an architectural confession. It is a monument that openly bears the scar of a mid-construction crisis, a permanent record of a profound, pragmatic calculation made under the pressure of failing stone. Unlike the silent ruin of Meidum, the bent pyramid speaks clearly of a problem diagnosed and a solution imposed, not with aesthetic grace, but with ruthless, survivalist logic. It is the pivotal experiment in the transition to the true pyramid form, a structure where the theoretical ambition of a smooth-sided geometric ideal collided with the physical reality of structural limits, and where the latter forced a compromise that saved the entire endeavor from collapse. The original design and its flawed ambition. The pyramid, built by Snefru, began with soaring confidence. Its lower section, comprising roughly half of its total height, rises from the desert at an extraordinarily steep angle of 54 to 55 degrees. This was steeper than the intended slope at Meidum and far steeper than any later pyramid. The choice of this angle was likely both symbolic and practical. A steeper pyramid is taller and more dramatic for a given base size, and it uses slightly less material. The builders employed a new, more robust construction technique compared to Meidum. The core was built of large, locally quarried limestone blocks laid in horizontal courses, a significant advance towards structural unity. The fine Tura limestone casing was carefully anchored to this core. 2 separate entrances on the north and west faces led to 2 independent sets of corbel-vaulted burial chambers, an unprecedented feature suggesting a complex funerary plan. The onset of structural crisis. As construction progressed, perhaps when the pyramid was about 50 meters high, alarming signs appeared. Cracks likely developed in the internal chambers and passageways, a symptom of intolerable stress. The underlying cause is Chapter 18, an overview of 4th Dynasty succession records. The staggering monuments of the 4th Dynasty, the Great Pyramid, the Sphinx, the vast complexes at Giza, loom so large in our imagination that they can eclipse the human framework that produced them. This framework was a sequence of successions, a transfer of the divine office from one king to the next. Our understanding of this sequence, however, is not drawn from vivid chronicles, but from a patchwork of dry, administrative records, fragmentary inscriptions, and the later, often mythologized accounts of historians like Manetho. Piecing together the Fourth Dynasty succession is an exercise in connecting sparse dots across a canvas of overwhelming stone, revealing a dynasty defined by concentrated power, prolific building, and a lineage that sought to cement its authority in eternity. The foundational transition, Sneferu to Khufu. The dynasty begins with Sneferu, a king of immense productivity who built not one, but three colossal pyramids, Mihdam, the Bent, and the Red. His reign represents the final consolidation of pyramid-building technique. The succession to his son, Khufu Cheops, is one of the best attested in the early Old Kingdom. Evidence comes from contemporary sources. A diorite statue fragment from Elephantine names Khufu as the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, son of Re, Sneferu. More tellingly, administrative papyri from the Red Sea harbor of Wadi el-Jarf, dating to Khufu's reign, mention the followers of Khufu and refer to the majesty of Sneferu in a past context, clearly establishing the father-son relationship and the smooth transfer of authority. There is no indication of conflict. The immense state apparatus Sneferu had mobilized simply continued its operations under a new royal name, redirecting its focus from Dashur to the Giza Plateau. The succession from Khufu, a murkier picture. The line from Khufu to his successors is where the historical record becomes notably thinner and more INT. Chapter 17, The Red Pyramid, Achieving the Ideal Slope. The Red Pyramid at Dashur stands as a statement of quiet resolution. After the stepped experiment of Mihdam and the alarming corrective bend of its southern neighbor, this monument represents the final successful synthesis. It is the first true, smooth-sided pyramid to be completed as originally conceived, from foundation to apex, without catastrophic compromise or radical mid-course alteration. It achieves the ideal not through daring innovation, but through the careful application of lessons learned, a monument born not of inspiration but of deduction. Its smooth, 43-degree slopes are the direct geometric expression of a solved equation. The calculus of the angle. The defining feature of the Red Pyramid is its consistent, shallow angle of approximately 43 degrees. This was not an arbitrary aesthetic choice. It was the empirically derived solution to the structural crisis witnessed during the construction of the Bent Pyramid. The steeper angles of Mihdam, 52 degree, and the lower section of the Bent Pyramid, 55 degree, had proven unstable, generating intolerable internal stresses and threatening collapse. The 43-degree angle of the Red Pyramid's design was a conservative, proven-safe parameter. It represented the optimal balance between monumental height and structural integrity, a formula that ensured the weight of the stone was channeled downward through the core with minimal disruptive outward thrust. This angle would become the standard for Sneferu's son, Khufu, at the Great Pyramid, which uses a very similar slope of 51.5 degrees, a slight and masterful refinement. Construction. Confidence in repetition. The construction of the Red Pyramid exhibits a newfound confidence born of precedent. The core is composed of reddish limestone blocks quarried locally at Dashur, which give the pyramid its modern name. Its original Tura limestone casing, now almost entirely stripped, would have made it gleam white. These core. Chapter 19. The quarrying process for core limestone blocks. The Great Pyramid is an artifice of subtraction. Before a single stone could be laid in its celestial geometry, it first had to be removed with immense effort from the living earth. The quarrying of the core limestone blocks, the roughly 2 million individual pieces that form the pyramid's internal mass, was the primary, brutal, and foundational industry of the Pyramid Age. This was not a matter of finding loose stones. It was a systematic, large-scale mining operation that transformed entire landscapes. The process was methodical, labor-intensive, and relied on a profound understanding of the stone's properties, a knowledge gained through millennia of prior use, from Paleolithic hand axes to the casing stones of Djoser's complex. Selecting the quarry. The core blocks for the Giza pyramids came not from a single source, but from a vast, open-cast quarry immediately south of the Great Pyramid's construction site. This proximity was the single most important logistical decision. The Giza Plateau itself is composed of a thick stratum of nummulitic limestone, a sedimentary rock filled with fossilized shells, nummulites. This stone was of sufficient quality for the core. It was relatively soft when first exposed, hardening upon contact with air, and it occurred in thick, regular beds. By quarrying on-site, the builders eliminated the most difficult leg of transport. The quarry today is a dramatic sight, a vast, sunken bowl, its walls showing the clear vertical steps where ancient workers carved out the heart of the plateau to build upon its surface. The tools of extraction. The technology was Neolithic in its simplicity, yet devastatingly effective when deployed on an industrial scale. The primary tools were 1. Dolerite pounders. These are fist-sized to larger melon-sized balls of hard, igneous dolerite, painstakingly collected from the desert gravel beds east of the Nile. Dolerite is significantly harder than. Chapter 20. The logistical theories of stone transportation. Once a limestone block was freed from the bedrock of the Giza quarry, it faced a journey of a few hundred meters to the rising pyramid. For the finer Tura limestone casing stones, the journey began over 8 miles away, on the east bank of the Nile. For the granite of the King's Chamber, it started in Aswan, over 500 miles to the south. The transportation of these stones represents a logistical puzzle of a different order than quarrying, one of friction, incline, and coordination on a colossal scale. No single, definitive manual from the Old Kingdom survives. Instead, we have a constellation of theories, each supported by fragments of archaeological evidence, practical physics, and iconographic hints from later periods. These theories coalesce around a central truth. The Egyptians did not possess magic or alien technology, but rather an unsurpassed mastery of simple machines, large-scale labor organization, and the shrewd use of their environment. The foundation, the sledge, and the lubricated road. The core technology for moving multi-ton stone blocks was almost certainly the wooden sledge. This is not a guess. A famous scene from the tomb of the Middle Kingdom nobleman Jehudi-Hotep shows a colossal alabaster statue being transported on a large wooden sledge, pulled by rows of laborers with ropes. A figure standing on the statue's knees pours a liquid from a vase onto the ground in front of the sledge's runners. The caption reads, "The going of the monument from the quarry. How happy is everyone, seeing its beauty." The liquid is believed to be water, acting as a lubricant to reduce friction. Archaeology at Giza and other pyramid sites provides corroborating evidence. At the Old Kingdom Harbor Complex adjacent to the Great Pyramid, archaeologists have found traces of a massive, paved causeway leading from the Nile floodplain up to the plateau. More tellingly, at the satellite pyramid of Menkaure, Atem. Chapter 21. The debate on ramp configurations. A summary of academic views. With the pyramid's base completed and the structure beginning its ascent into the sky, the primary logistical conundrum shifts from horizontal drag to vertical lift. The question of how the final stones, particularly those of the upper third, were raised to heights exceeding 100 meters, remains the most persistent technical debate in Egyptology. There is no consensus, no single definitive answer preserved in tomb texts or royal decrees. Instead, the field is characterized by a plurality of competing models, each championed by respected scholars and engineers, each with its own internal logic and its own set of archaeological and practical objections. This chapter will not solve the debate, but will methodically outline its primary contours, summarizing the academic views as a series of proposed solutions to an ancient engineering problem. The straight linear ramp, the giant causeway model. Proposal: a single, massive ramp of mud brick, limestone chips, and gypsum mortar, built against one face of the pyramid, growing in length and height as the pyramid grew. Proponents: a traditional view, often presented in popular histories and introductory texts due to its conceptual simplicity. Mechanics: to maintain a workable slope for hauling sledges, estimated at a maximum 1:10 ratio, or about a 7 to 8 degree incline, the ramp's length would have to increase proportionally with the pyramid's height. By the final course, the ramp would be over 1 kilometer long. Arguments for: it is straightforward to build and use, provides a wide, stable work platform for hauling teams, and allows for continuous access to the entire rising face of the pyramid. Evidence for large, straight ramps exists at other sites like the causeway of the Bent Pyramid. Arguments against: the volume of material required becomes astronomically large. potentially exceeding the volume of the pyramid itself. The Constructee. Chapter 22. The precision leveling of the Giza Plateau bedrock. Before the first stone of the Great Pyramid could be set, before ramps were plotted or quarries opened, the builders faced a task of foundational perfection, transforming a vast, irregular expanse of natural limestone plateau into a plain of near-absolute flatness. The Giza Plateau is not a billiard table. It slopes gently from northwest to southeast, with natural dips, rises, and weathered outcrops. The creation of a perfectly level base, over an area of 5.3 hectares, 13 acres, for the Great Pyramid alone, was the first and perhaps most critical engineering feat, one upon which the structural integrity and symbolic purity of the entire monument depended. This was not rough grading. It was an exercise in precision geodetics achieved with elemental tools. The imperative for leveling. The reasons were both practical and philosophical. Structurally, an uneven foundation would lead to uneven settlement under the pyramid's immense weight, potentially catastrophic as hinted at by the issues with the bent pyramid's base. Differential settlement could cause cracks, tilting, or even collapse. Symbolically, the pyramid was a machine for cosmic order, Ma'at. Its sides were aligned to the cardinal directions. Its apex would channel celestial forces. Such a structure could not rest on a foundation that was itself a reflection of terrestrial chaos. It had to be rooted in an artificial plane of perfect order, a man-made horizon. The method, the grid, and the water trench. The technique used was brilliantly simple, relying on the most predictable physical law available. Water seeks its own level. While no contemporary engineering manual survives, the method can be reconstructed from later practices and the evidence on the ground itself. 1. Establishing a perimeter. The chosen site was first roughly cleared and its intended corners staked out, likely using astronomy to achieve a near-perfect square aligned close to true N. Chapter 23. The Siting of the Great Pyramid, Cardinal Alignment Techniques. The Great Pyramid of Giza does not simply sit upon the plateau. It is embedded within it according to a cosmic blueprint. Its sides are aligned with the four cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west, with an accuracy that borders on the incomprehensible, deviating by an average of less than 0.06 degrees, about 3.5 arc minutes. This is not a fortunate accident of geography. It is the result of a deliberate, sophisticated, and methodical process of astronomical observation and terrestrial measurement. A process that married the vault of heaven to the limestone of the desert with serene precision. The techniques used to achieve this alignment, while not fully documented, can be inferred through a combination of later texts, architectural evidence, and practical astronomy. The imperative for alignment. The alignment served a profound dual purpose. Practically, it established a fixed orthogonal grid for construction, ensuring geometric perfection and simplifying the laying of millions of blocks. Symbolically, it anchored the pyramid, and by extension the king's afterlife, within the eternal cyclical machinery of the cosmos. The north-south axis connected the structure to the circumpolar stars, the imperishable ones that never set, a realm of eternal existence. The east-west axis tracked the path of the sun god Ra, the primary deity of resurrection, linking the pyramid to the daily cycle of death and rebirth. The pyramid was a terrestrial echo of celestial order, and that echo had to be perfectly tuned. Primary theory. The circle and pole method, the Indian circle. The most widely accepted theory for achieving such precise cardinal alignment is a method so simple it is elegant, requiring no complex instruments beyond a clear night sky, a plumb bob, and a length of cord. 1. Selecting a reference star. The builder astronomers would have observed the night sky focusing not on the north. Chapter 24. The internal layout of the Great Pyramid, a corridor catalog. Beneath the serene, monolithic exterior of the Great Pyramid lies not a solid mass, but a precise and enigmatic network of passages, chambers, and architectural anomalies. This internal layout is a meticulously planned sequence of spaces, each with a hypothesized function in the king's journey to eternity. To understand it is to follow a predetermined, one-way route from the world of the living to the sealed realm of the dead. It is less a palace for the living than a machine for resurrection, and its components can be catalogued as a series of interconnected functional units. 1. The original entrance. Located not at the center of the north face, but offset to the east of the midline, about 17 meters above the original ground level. It is formed by a corbelled arch of massive limestone blocks. This was the only intended access point for the funeral procession and the final sealing crew. Its height above the base likely served a practical purpose, to be quickly buried by the rising pyramid courses, concealing it, and a symbolic one, placing the transition from life to death above the mundane plane. 2. The descending passage. From the entrance, a corridor plunges straight down into the bedrock beneath the pyramid at an angle of 26 degrees 31 feet 23 inches. It is a tight, rectangular shaft, approximately 1.2 meters high and 1 meter wide, lined with fine limestone. It descends for over 100 meters, passing directly through the pyramid's masonry and then deep into the solid limestone plateau. Its unswerving trajectory southward creates a powerful, funneling axis. 3. The subterranean chamber, the pit. At the end of the descending passage, the corridor levels out briefly before opening into a rough-hewn, unfinished chamber carved directly from the bedrock. This room is irregular in shape, with a peculiar, corbelled niche in its east wall and a pit dug into its floor, which may have been intended to hold a sarcophagus. Chapter 25. The function of the ascending and descending passages. Within the Hermetic architecture of the Great Pyramid, the ascending and descending passages are not merely corridors for transit. They are the primary channels of a symbolic and functional circuit. Their identical steep 26-degree slope, a precise geometric constant, and their intimate connection suggest they were conceived as a single, coherent system. Their function is tripartite: ritual, logistical, and astronomical. They form the critical artery connecting the world of the living with the sepulchral and celestial realms within the monument. The descending passage, the pathway to the netherworld. The descending passage begins at the only original entrance and plunges unerringly southward and downward. Its trajectory is singular and absolute. In a funerary context, its primary function was to facilitate the progress of the royal funeral cortege into the heart of the monument. The body of the king, encased within its coffin, would have been borne down this narrow, sloping shaft, a literal descent into the earth, mirroring the solar journey into the underworld and the king's assimilation with Osiris, Lord of the Duat. However, its endpoint is significant. It leads directly to the subterranean chamber, the rough, unfinished cavern carved into the bedrock. This suggests a powerful symbolic function. Many Egyptologists interpret this lower chamber as representing the chaotic, chthonic realm of the underworld itself. The passage, therefore, served as a conduit to this realm. It is possible the chamber was always intended as a symbolic destination, a false tomb or a component of a ritual journey, rather than the actual burial site. The passage ensured the king's ritual connection to this foundational, subterranean sphere of existence before his rebirth. The ascending passage, the corridor of rebirth. The ascending passage, branching off from the descending passage, represents a dramatic reversal of direction. Chapter 26. The King's Chamber, Dimensions and Granite Specifications. The King's Chamber of the Great Pyramid is a space of profound austerity and overwhelming material presence. It represents the culmination of the internal journey, the final, sealed cell where the physical and spiritual transformation of the king was to be completed. Its impact derives not from decoration. Its walls are stark and uninscribed, but from its monumental proportions and the awe-inspiring quality of its construction. It is a study in precision, mass, and the symbolic power of imported stone. Dimensions and proportions, a geometry of eternity. The chamber is a rectangular parallelepiped of exacting dimensions that it measures 10.47 meters, 34 feet 4 inches. In length, east-west, 5.23 meters, 17 feet 2 inches. In width, north-south, and 5.84 meters, 19 feet 2 inches, in height. These figures are significant. The ratio of length to width is precisely 2:1. The height is square root 5 times half the width, a relationship that incorporates the golden ratio, phi, into the chamber's geometry. Whether this was intentional or a byproduct of a simpler modular design is debated, but the result is a room of harmonious, mathematical proportions that feel both enclosed and expansive. The volume of the chamber is approximately 321 cubic meters. This space is dominated by a single object, a lidless, rectangular sarcophagus made from a single block of Aswan granite, slightly too wide to have fit through the ascending passage, proving it was emplaced during construction. The sarcophagus's interior dimensions are themselves precise, suggesting it was designed to hold a specific, now vanished inner coffin or shrine. The granite, a statement of imperishability. The defining characteristic of the king's chamber is its material. Every surface, walls, floor, and ceiling, is composed of massive blocks of red granite quarried at Aswan, over 800 kilometers to the south. This choice was profoundly deliberate and symbolic. 1. Practical Properties, GRA. Chapter 27. A description of the so-called air shafts, emanating from the north and south walls of the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber within the Great Pyramid are 4 narrow, square-section shafts. For centuries, these features were mislabeled as air vents or air shafts, a functional attribution born of modern assumptions about ventilation. Contemporary research, however, has decisively shifted understanding away from a practical purpose toward a profound ritual and astronomical one. They are more accurately termed stellar shafts or sightlines, and their description reveals a sophisticated integration of celestial observation into the very fabric of the tomb. Physical description and discovery. The shafts are small, with sides measuring approximately 20 centimeters, 8 inches. Too narrow for any human or meaningful airflow to pass. Their construction is a marvel of precision in its own right. They are not simple, straight bores. Each shaft angles upward through over 50 meters of solid masonry and core stone before reaching the outer surface. The ones from the King's Chamber exit on the north and south faces of the pyramid. The shafts from the Queen's Chamber, discovered sealed at both ends by Rudolf Gantenbrink in 1993 using a robotic camera, do not pierce the outer casing. They terminate within the masonry, their ends blocked by small limestone doors with copper handles. The engineering required to maintain the precise angle of these shafts through the chaotic internal core of the pyramid, ensuring they emerged at the correct point on the exterior, was non-trivial. It implies they were planned from the earliest phases of construction, their trajectories calculated and followed with care. The astronomical alignment hypothesis. The revolutionary understanding of these shafts began with the work of Egyptologist Alexander Badawi and astronomer Virginia Trimble in the 1960s. They proposed that the shafts were not for air, but for stars. Calculations O. Chapter 28. The Queen's Chamber. A nomenclature misconception. Deep within the heart of the Great Pyramid, offset from the central axis along a horizontal passage branching from the Grand Gallery, lies a small, elegant room with a peaked, gabled ceiling. Since the Middle Ages, Arab explorers and later European Egyptologists have referred to this space as the Queen's Chamber. This title is a persistent and profound misnomer, a historical accident that obscures the room's true, enigmatic function within the pyramid's carefully orchestrated ritual program. There is no evidence, architectural, textual, or archaeological, to suggest it was ever intended for the burial of a queen or any female member of the royal family. The name is a relic of interpretive error, and the chamber's actual purpose remains one of the pyramid's more compelling puzzles. The origins of the misnomer. The error likely stems from the chamber's form. Unlike the stark, granite-walled King's Chamber, this room has a more finished appearance than the subterranean chamber, but is less austere than the king's final resting place. Its gabled ceiling, constructed from large limestone blocks, resembles the shape of a sarcophagus lid or a shrine. To early explorers, familiar with the later classical and medieval traditions of separate royal burial chambers, this smaller, subsidiary room naturally suggested a consort's tomb. The Arabic name Maqba al-Malika cemented this assumption in Western literature. However, the burial customs of the early 4th dynasty were unequivocal. Queens were buried in their own, smaller pyramids or mastabas adjacent to the king's, not within his monument. The 3 small pyramids on the Giza Plateau's east side are the actual queenly tombs. Architectural description and anomalies. The Queen's Chamber is precisely oriented on the pyramid's east-west axis. It measures approximately 5.7 meters by 5.2 meters, with the gabled ceiling rising to a central height of 6.2 meters. Its walls are. Chapter 29. The Subterranean Chamber. Its unfinished state. Beneath the immense, geometric certainty of the Great Pyramid lies a space of striking contrast. The Subterranean Chamber, also known as the Pit or the Underground Chamber, located at the end of the long, descending passageway, deep in the bedrock of the Giza Plateau. This room presents a scene of apparent abandonment and raw, unfinished effort. Its rough-hewn walls, irregular floor, and seemingly purposeless features stand in stark opposition to the polished perfection of the chambers above. This unfinished state is not an accident or a sign of failure, but rather a powerful, intentional piece of evidence in understanding the pyramid's evolving design and its deep symbolic architecture. Physical description: a cavern of chaos. Reached via the 100-meter-long descending passage, the subterranean chamber is carved directly from the living limestone of the plateau. Unlike the masonry-built rooms above, its form is organic and crude. The chamber is irregular in shape, roughly rectangular but with uneven walls and a floor that slopes and is pitted with irregularities. In the center of the floor is a square, vertical shaft, about 3 meters deep, often filled with debris. This is sometimes called the well or the pit within the pit. Against the east wall is a low, corbelled niche or small recess, also roughly formed. The ceiling is uneven, and the quality of the stonework is purely functional. The marks of stone pounders are clearly visible, with none of the dressing or polishing seen elsewhere. The atmosphere is damp, cool, and palpably separate from the dry, geometric world above. Theories on its unfinished nature. The chamber's crude appearance has led to several interpretations, which broadly fall into two categories: those that see it as a project abandoned due to a change in plan, and those that view its unfinished state as symbolically intentional. 1. The abandoned burial chamber theory. This is the Tra. Chapter 30. Khufu's solar boats. The wood types identified. On the southern flank of the Great Pyramid, sealed within 5 long, rectangular pits carved directly into the Giza bedrock, Khufu's architects interred not more stone, but wood. In 1954, the dismantled remains of a magnificent cedarwood vessel were discovered in one of these pits, meticulously disassembled and arranged in a logical, layered stack. This vessel, now known as Khufu's solar boat or the Khufu ship, is one of the most significant archaeological discoveries from the Old Kingdom. Its preservation is a miracle, but equally telling is the specific identity of the woods from which it was built. An arboreal ledger that maps the economic reach, symbolic priorities, and sophisticated craftsmanship of the 4th Dynasty state. The discovery and the vessel's purpose. When archaeologist Kamal El-Malik uncovered the pit, he found over 1,200 pieces of wood, along with ropes of halfa grass and reed mats. The pieces were not mere rubble. They were the carefully labeled components of a large, seagoing vessel, ranging from massive planks to tiny dowels. Its painstaking reconstruction, which took years, revealed a ship 43.6 meters long, with a distinctive curved hull, a large central cabin, and oars for propulsion. This was not a model but a functional, if ritual, craft. Its purpose was religious. In Egyptian solar theology, the sun god Ra traversed the sky by day in a day boat, Mandet, and journeyed through the underworld at night in a night boat, Mesektet. The deceased king, having become one with Ra, required his own vessel to accompany the god on this eternal cycle. The boat buried at the pyramid was likely the funerary vessel that carried Khufu's body across the Nile to his necropolis, and was then interred to serve him in the afterlife. A second, similar boat was discovered in an adjacent pit in the 1980s, and others likely remain buried, perhaps representing the different craft needed for the day and night. Chapter 31. The Mortuary Temple of Khufu. Foundations and basalt paving. On the eastern side of the Great Pyramid, between the colossal stone mass and the now-vanished Valley Temple on the Nile's edge, once stood the Mortuary Temple of Khufu. Unlike the pyramid, which has endured in near-perfect geometric defiance of time, the temple has been almost entirely erased. What remains is a ghostly imprint, a rectangular plan outlined by foundation trenches cut into the bedrock and, most evocatively, fragments of a distinctive dark pavement. This scant evidence, however, is sufficient to reconstruct the temple's essential form and to understand its critical role in the perpetual cult of the deified king. The temple's function, the interface of cult. The mortuary temple was not a public place of worship. It was the operational and ritual headquarters for the king's eternal afterlife cult. Its purpose was twofold. 1. Ritual sustenance. Here, priests performed daily ceremonies to provide offerings of food, drink, incense, and clothing for the king's ka. These rituals, believed to magically sustain the king in the afterlife, were funded by endowments of land and labor assigned to the temple in perpetuity. 2. Administrative center. The temple housed the archives, granaries, workshops, and residences for the priesthood and staff who maintained the cult. It was a functioning economic institution designed to last forever. The architectural plan, foundations in the rock. Archaeological clearance has revealed the temple's foundation plan, cut directly into the Giza Plateau's limestone. It was a rectangular structure, oriented east-west, attached directly to the center of the pyramid's eastern face. The layout followed a classic, simple pattern that would become standard for Old Kingdom pyramid temples. An outer section and an inner sanctuary. The foundations outline a series of rooms and corridors. The entrance was from the east, likely via a columned portico leading from the Kazu. Chapter 32, Khufu's Pyramid, the illusion of greater size. Following his father Khufu's monumental achievement, Khufu faced a profound dynastic and ideological challenge. How to build a successor tomb that affirmed his own power and divine status without appearing to surpass or diminish the already perfect monument of his predecessor. The solution was an architectural masterstroke of perception. Khufu's Pyramid, the second and central pyramid of the Giza Triad, employs subtle but deliberate sighting and proportional tricks to create the powerful, enduring illusion that it is the largest of the three. While actually slightly smaller in both height and volume than the Great Pyramid, it consistently appears grander to the observer on the plateau, a testament to the sophisticated understanding of visual psychology possessed by its ancient architects. The hard numbers, a comparative reality. Objectively, Khufu's Pyramid is the lesser of the two giants. Khufu's Pyramid, Great Pyramid, original height 146.6 meters, base length 230.3 meters. Khufu's Pyramid, original height 143.5 meters, base length 215.25 meters. In both absolute height and volume, Khufu's monument retains supremacy. However, perception is governed by more than raw statistics. The strategies of illusion. 1. Elevated foundation. The most significant factor is the pyramid's foundation. Khufu's Pyramid was built on a section of the Giza Plateau that is approximately 10 meters higher than the base of Khufu's Pyramid. This elevated footing gives it a tremendous head start. When viewed from the Nile Valley to the east or from the general vicinity of the Sphinx, its apex appears to pierce the sky at a level equal to or even above that of the Great Pyramid, despite being physically shorter. 2. Steeper slope angle. Khufu's Pyramid was built with a steeper inclination, approximately 53 degrees 10 minutes, compared to Khufu's 51 degrees 50 minutes. This steeper angle makes the sides converge more sharply, creating a more pronoun. Chapter 33. The geology of the Giza Plateau and local quarry sites. The Giza Plateau is not merely a convenient flat space near the Nile. It is a specific geological formation whose characteristics dictated the very possibility, form, and location of the world's most famous pyramids. Its geology is the unseen, determining hand behind the monumental landscape. To understand why the pyramids are here, and why they are as they are, one must read the story written in its limestone strata. The Mokattam Formation, the pyramid's substance. The plateau is composed of sedimentary rock from the Middle Eocene Mokattam Formation, deposited roughly 40 to 50 million years ago in a shallow, warm sea. This formation is characterized by thick beds of relatively soft, nummulitic limestone. Nummulites are large, disc-shaped fossils of single-celled organisms, foraminifera, and their abundance gives the stone a distinctive, grainy texture. This local limestone formed the core material for all the Giza pyramids. Its advantages were proximity and workability. It could be quarried in massive quantities directly from the plateau itself using simple tools like dolerite pounders and copper chisels. The vast quarries southeast of the Great Pyramid, now Great Sunken Pits, are the negative spaces left after extracting millions of cubic meters of this stone. Stratigraphic advantage: a stable, layered foundation. The Mokattam limestone at Giza is not a homogeneous mass, but is laid down in distinct, horizontal strata or beds, separated by thin layers of marl or shale. This stratification was crucial for the builders. 1. Natural quarrying planes. The contacts between the harder limestone beds and the softer marl layers provided natural fracture planes. Quarrymen could exploit these weaknesses, using wooden wedges and water to split gigantic blocks free along these natural lines with remarkable efficiency. 2. A stable base. The strata dip very gently about 3 to 4 degrees to the southeast. This provided. Chapter 34. Menkaur's Pyramid. The use of granite casing stones. The third and smallest of the Giza pyramids, built for Menkaur, represents a subtle but significant shift in the aesthetic and material priorities of the Fourth Dynasty. While its reduced scale is often noted, perhaps reflecting diminished resources, a shorter reign, or a shifting focus from mass to refinement, its most defining characteristic is its extensive use of granite. Menkaur's pyramid is distinguished by being sheathed, for roughly the lower third of its height, in massive, polished blocks of red Aswan granite. This choice marks a departure from the pure limestone brilliance of his predecessors' monuments and signifies a deeper investment in the symbolic language of stone, prioritizing imperishable material over sheer, blinding whiteness. The construction sequence and material shift. The pyramid's core, like the others, was built from local Giza limestone. However, the casing plan was ambitious and twofold. The upper two-thirds of the pyramid were intended to be cased in the traditional fine white Tura limestone, creating the expected smooth, luminous slope. The lower courses, however, were encased in granite. This was not an afterthought. The granite blocks are foundational. They are larger and more meticulously shaped than typical limestone casing stones, with some in the lowest courses weighing over 30 tons. The use of such heavy, intractable material at the base suggests it was integral to the original design, intended from the outset. The logistical implication was profound. While the Tura limestone came from across the Nile, the granite had to be transported over 500 miles downstream from the quarries at Aswan. The commitment to sheathing the lower pyramid in this stone represents an enormous diversion of state effort toward a specific aesthetic and theological statement. The symbolism of granite, from solar to chthonic. The choice of granite is laden with meaning that in Egyptian symbolism. Chapter 35. The Valley Temples. A functional analysis of ritual purification. Flanked by the desert plateau and the life-giving Nile floodplain, the Valley Temple served as the critical transitional hinge in the pyramid complex. It was neither tomb nor final resting place, but a liminal space where the worlds of the living, the dead, and the divine converged. Its function was predominantly ritual, specifically focused on the purification and transformation of the king's body, and by extension, his eternal spirit, preparing it for the final ascent to the eternal house on the plateau. A functional analysis of these structures, best exemplified by the remarkably preserved Valley Temple of Khafre at Giza, reveals a carefully choreographed sequence of spaces designed for a solemn, transformative procedure. The nexus of logistics and liturgy. Situated at the edge of the cultivated land, often connected to a canal or harbor, the Valley Temple was the logistical reception point. The king's body, transported by sacred barge from the royal residence at Memphis, would arrive here. But its purpose immediately transcended the mundane. The temple converted a point of physical arrival into a station of spiritual transition. It was the first act in the funeral drama, where the mortal remains began their ritual journey towards deification. The architectural sequence, a path of progressive sanctification. The Valley Temple was built for processional movement. The plan was typically a robust, T-shaped or rectangular structure of massive limestone and granite blocks, designed for permanence and seclusion rather than public spectacle. 1. The entrance and harbor. The approach was via water. The temple's quay allowed the funerary barge to dock directly at its doorstep. This aquatic arrival was symbolic. The king crossed the Nile, the boundary between the realms of the living, the East Bank, and the dead, the West Bank. 2. The columned hall or vestibule. Upon entry, the procession would move. Chapter 36. The Sphinx, geological evidence of water erosion theories. The Great Sphinx of Giza, a colossal limestone statue with the body of a lion and the head of a king, generally accepted as Khafre, sits in its own enclosure, seemingly gazing eternally eastward. While its iconic form is universally recognized, its age and the processes that have shaped its heavily eroded body are subjects of a quiet but persistent geological debate. This debate centers on the patterns of erosion visible on the Sphinx's core body and the walls of its enclosure, patterns that some researchers argue are inconsistent with wind and sand abrasion and instead point to a far older origin, sculpted by substantial water runoff. The orthodox chronology and erosion model. The conventional Egyptological view dates the Sphinx to the reign of Khafre in the Old Kingdom, c. 2500 BCE. The erosion observed is attributed to the dominant arid forces of the Sahara over the last 4,500 years. Wind abrasion and exfoliation. In this model, harsh, sand-bearing winds have scoured the softer layers of the limestone, while thermal expansion and contraction, exfoliation, have caused the stone to flake and peel. The Sphinx has been buried to its neck in sand for much of its history, which would have protected its body while leaving its head and upper back exposed to these aeolian processes. Proponents of this view point to the clear, sharp, and relatively recent weathering on the head and upper shoulders, believed to be from wind and exfoliation, as matching the expected pattern for its accepted age. The water erosion hypothesis. The alternative theory, most notably advanced by geologist Dr. Robert M. Schoch in the early 1990s, focuses on the deep, vertical, and undulating erosion patterns on the walls of the Sphinx enclosure and the lower parts of the statue itself. Schoch argues that these features, deep vertical fissures, rolling, wave-like hollows, and preferential erosion of the softer limestone layers, are c. Chapter 38. The decline in pyramid size in the 5th dynasty. Following the colossal achievements of the 4th dynasty at Giza and Dashur, the 5th dynasty, circa 2494 to 2345 BCE, presents a conspicuous architectural trend, a marked and consistent reduction in the physical scale of royal pyramids. The pyramids of Userkaf, Sahur, Neferurker, Neferfra, Nusair, and Menkaure are significantly smaller, with less refined construction, and are situated at the new necropolis of Abu Sur, north of Saqqara. This decline in size is not a symptom of cultural decay or a loss of technical knowledge, but rather a strategic reallocation of resources and a fundamental shift in the theological and economic priorities of the Egyptian state. The empirical data, a shift in scale. Compare the archetypes. 4th dynasty, Great Pyramid of Khufu, 146.6 m height, 230 m base. 5th dynasty, Pyramid of Neferurker, the largest of the dynasty's 70 m height, originally planned for 105 m but unfinished, 105 m base. The reduction is dramatic, often by more than half in linear dimensions, representing a far greater reduction in volume and mass. The core construction also changed, utilizing a framework of limestone walls filled with rubble and sand, a faster, cheaper method than the precise horizontal coursing of 4th dynasty cores. Theological reorientation, from solar mountain to solar temple. The primary driver of this shift was a profound change in royal ideology. The 5th dynasty is traditionally considered the period when the cult of Ra, the sun god, attained its zenith in state theology. The kings styled themselves Son of Ra, a title that became a permanent part of the royal titulary. This theological focus led to a massive diversion of resources. The defining architectural project of the 5th dynasty was no longer the pyramid alone, but the Sun Temple. Each king, or most of them, built a dedicated solar cult complex at Abu Ghurab, near Abu Sur. These temples, like that of Nusair, were elaborate. Chapter 37. The Inventory Stela and Later Restoration Efforts. Amidst the original, monumental construction of the Giza complex. A later artifact speaks of a different, quieter form of engagement with the past. Maintenance, memory, and reinterpretation. The so-called inventory stela, discovered by Auguste Mariette in the 1850s within the ruins of the Temple of Isis at Giza, a much later structure built near the Sphinx and the pyramids, provides a fascinating and problematic glimpse into how the New Kingdom pharaohs, 1,000 years after Khufu, viewed and restored these already ancient monuments. The stela's claims are historically dubious, but its existence is a powerful testament to the enduring sacredness of the site and the ongoing practice of royal piety through restoration. The content of the stela, a legendary narrative. The stela purports to date from the reign of Khufu himself, but is stylistically and linguistically a product of the late period, likely the 26th dynasty, c. 664 to 525 BCE, presents a legendary account. It states that Khufu discovered the Temple of Isis, mistress of the pyramid, already existing beside the Sphinx. More dramatically, it claims that the Great Sphinx was already in place during Khufu's time, and that a mighty sycamore tree growing beside it was struck by lightning, damaging the statue, which Khufu then repaired. It also lists an inventory of statues and offerings within the temple. The historical claims are almost certainly false. There is no archaeological evidence for a temple of Isis or a cult of the Sphinx dating to the 4th dynasty. The stela is a classic example of pious fraud or archaizing fiction. A later priesthood, perhaps of the Temple of Isis built during the New Kingdom, created the stela to legitimize their temple's antiquity, connect it directly to the legendary builder Khufu, and secure its income and prestige by grounding its foundation in the most distant and glorious past imaginable. The reality of New. Chapter 39, The Shift to Pyramid Texts. A taxonomy of utterances. The architectural silence of the 4th dynasty pyramids, their stark, uninscribed chambers, is broken in the 5th dynasty. Within the burial chamber of King Unas, the last ruler of the dynasty, circa 2350 BCE, the walls are covered from floor to ceiling with columns of finely incised hieroglyphs, painted blue. These are the earliest known pyramid texts, a vast corpus of spells, incantations, hymns, and ritual utterances designed to secure the king's safe passage, transformation, and glorious existence in the afterlife. This shift from implicit architectural symbolism to explicit written magic represents one of the most significant developments in Egyptian religious history. To understand this shift is not to read a narrative, but to categorize a functional toolkit for divinity. The nature of the texts, a non-linear ritual script. The pyramid texts are not a story or a unified theological treatise. They are a ritual anthology, a collection of independent utterances, Egyptian, Medu, each with a specific magical purpose. They were likely recited by priests during the funeral and subsequent cult ceremonies. Their appearance on the walls transformed the tomb from a mere container into an active, magical instrument. The spells were now permanently activated, surrounding the king for eternity. A taxonomy of utterances. The over 700 individual utterances found across the pyramids of Unas, Teti, Pepi I, Merenra, and Pepi II can be broadly categorized by their primary function. 1. Utterances of protection and warding. Function: to create a sacred, safe space around the king's body and spirit. They ward off snakes, scorpions, and malevolent beings. O you with a spine who are in the brow of Re, turn away your sting from Unas. Example: spells to magically seal the tomb or to empower the sarcophagus as a fortress. 2. Utterances of transfiguration and deification. Function: the core of the texts. These. Chapter 40. The Sun Temples of Abu Ghurab, a comparison of altar designs. While the 5th dynasty pyramids at nearby Abu Sir grew smaller, a new and dominant form of royal expression arose on the desert edge at Abu Ghurab, the Sun Temple. Dedicated exclusively to the cult of Ra, these temples represent the theological zenith of solar worship in the Old Kingdom. Their defining feature was not a tomb, but a massive, open-air altar complex centered on a colossal symbol of the sun. The design and variety of these altars provide a direct insight into the evolving ritual mechanics and symbolic vocabulary of the solar cult. A comparison of the two best-preserved examples, those of Userkaf and Nusair, reveals a progression from a simple, potent symbol to an elaborate, multifunctional ritual landscape. The core theology and shared elements. All sun temples served the same primary function: to facilitate the king's direct relationship with Ra and to harness the sun's life-giving and regenerative power for the king's afterlife and, by extension, for all of Egypt. They shared a common basic plan: a valley temple by the Nile, a long causeway ascending to the desert, and a large, rectangular enclosure on the plateau containing the cultic heart. This heart always comprised two key elements: a massive obelisk, called a benbenet, a feminine form of the benben stone, and a large sacrificial altar, the Sun Temple of Userkaf, the prototype. Userkaf, founder of the 5th dynasty, built the first known sun temple, Nechen-Re, the fortress of Re. Its altar arrangement was monumental in its simplicity. The altar. The central feature was a gigantic, monolithic altar carved from a single block of alabaster, calcite. This altar was not a table, but a massive, rectangular slab set in a shallow basin in the courtyard, directly in front of the obelisk's pedestal. Its surface is carved with a deeply incised scene of the Hebsed, Jubilee Festival, specifically, the ritual circuit of the King Aru. Chapter 41. The administrative decentralization of the late Old Kingdom. The towering monuments of the 4th and 5th dynasties represent the apex of a hypercentralized state, where the will of the God-King could command the labor and resources of the entire Nile Valley. However, the long reign of Pepi II, circa 2278 to 2184 BCE, the last significant ruler of the Old Kingdom, 6th dynasty, witnessed the zenith of this system and the beginning of its slow, systemic unraveling. The period following his death, leading into the First Intermediate Period, is characterized not by a sudden collapse, but by a gradual process of administrative decentralization. Power, wealth, and authority seeped away from the royal residence at Memphis and into the hands of provincial governors, nomarchs, leading to a fundamental restructuring of Egyptian society. A shift from a pyramid of power to a patchwork of local authorities. The seeds of decentralization, the policy of exemption decrees. Ironically, the process was partially enabled by royal policy. To ensure the smooth functioning of the state and the perpetual cult of the king, pharaohs issued exemption decrees. These were royal edicts carved on stone, granting specific temples, funerary estates, or towns immunity from certain state obligations. The corvée labor levy, the requisition of boats and animals, and the intrusion of royal officials. While intended to protect vital institutions, these decrees had a long-term corrosive effect. They created pockets of land and population that were effectively outside the direct control of the Central Treasury and Labor Bureau. Over generations, as more decrees were issued to more nobles and temples, the pool of directly controllable resources and manpower shrank. The rise of the provincial nobility. Concurrent with this was the growth in power of the nomarchs. Initially appointed royal administrators, these governors of the nomes, provinces, began to cement their local power bases. They built large. Chapter 42. Climatic factors in the First Intermediate Period. The transition from the unified, monumental Old Kingdom to the fragmented, troubled era known as the First Intermediate Period, circa 2181 to 2055 BCE, was long attributed solely to political failure and administrative collapse. However, increasing paleoclimatological evidence suggests that a significant and prolonged environmental crisis acted as a powerful stressor, exacerbating social and political tensions and fundamentally undermining the economic basis of the pharaonic state. This was not a single cataclysmic event, but a creeping disaster of failed rains and falling waters. A slow drought that starved both the land and the legitimacy of the kings who were its divine guarantors. The Nile's dependence, beyond the Egyptian flood. While the Egyptian Nile flood was, and is, primarily fed by the monsoonal rains of the Ethiopian highlands, the Blue Nile, the river's total flow and health also depended on contributions from the White Nile, fed by equatorial rainfall, and, critically during this period, from rainfall over the Sahara itself. During the earlier Holocene wet phase, the Sahara was a savanna with lakes and rivers. As the climate shifted towards aridity after 3500 BCE, Egypt's environment became more narrowly dependent on the Ethiopian monsoon. A weakening or failure of this monsoon system would have had direct, catastrophic consequences for the Nile flood. Evidence for a low Nile period. Multiple lines of evidence point to a period of significantly reduced Nile floods during the Late Old Kingdom and First Intermediate period. 1. Ice core and sediment data. Analysis of ice cores from Mount Kilimanjaro and sediment cores from the Nile Delta and the eastern Mediterranean show evidence of a pronounced dry period in tropical Africa beginning around 2200 BCE and lasting for several centuries. This coincides almost exactly with the onset of the First Intermediate period. 2. Famine stele and literary texts. Chapter 43. The Reunification under Mentuhotep II. A chronological overview. The First Intermediate period, an era of fragmented rule, regional conflict, and climatic stress, found its terminus in the relentless, methodical campaigns of a Theban prince who would become King Mentuhotep II Nebuchadnezzar. His reign, circa 2055 to 2004 BCE, marks the beginning of the Middle Kingdom, an epoch of reunification, cultural renaissance, and administrative reformation. The process was not a single battle, but a protracted, decades-long project of military conquest, political assimilation, and symbolic restoration. A chronological overview of his reign reveals the steady, deliberate mechanics of putting Egypt back together. Early reign, circa 2055 to 2040 BCE, the Theban consolidation. Upon ascending the throne of the 11th dynasty, which already controlled much of Upper Egypt from its capital at Thebes, Mentuhotep II's initial focus was securing his southern flank and consolidating power. His early years are marked by the traditional titulary of a Theban king ruling over Upper Egypt. The political landscape of Egypt was divided, with the rival 10th dynasty ruling from Heracleopolis in Middle Egypt, controlling the Nile north to the delta. The first decade of his reign likely involved securing Theban hegemony over the southern nomes, provinces, and preparing for the inevitable northern conflict. The Heracleopolitan War and Reunification, circa 2040 to 2035 BCE. The central event of his reign was the war against the Heracleopolitan kings. The exact chronology of campaigns is hazy, but it was a sustained effort. Year 14. This is a pivotal date. An inscription at the Shat Erigal, a quarry site, shows Mentuhotep II wearing the red crown of Lower Egypt for the first time, though the war was not yet complete. This was a bold declaration of intent. The conquest. Thebes possessed significant advantages: control of the manpower of Upper Egypt and, critically, access to the Nubian gold trade, which Fu. Chapter 44. Middle Kingdom Pyramid Revival. The use of mud-brick cores. Following the reunification of Egypt by Mentuhotep II, the pharaohs of the Middle Kingdom, particularly the powerful 12th dynasty, sought to reconnect with the glorious architectural tradition of the Old Kingdom. They revived the pyramid as the canonical royal tomb. However, their approach was not one of slavish imitation, but of pragmatic adaptation. The most defining technical feature of Middle Kingdom pyramids is their construction method: a framework of stone walls filled with a core of mud brick and rubble. This hybrid technique represents a calculated balance between symbolic continuity, economic reality, and the hard-earned logistical lessons of the past. The symbolic imperative and the pragmatic shift. The pyramid remained the supreme symbol of the sun god and the divine king. To rule a reunited Egypt, 12th dynasty pharaohs like Amenemhat I and Senusret I needed to visually and ideologically link themselves to the golden age of pyramid builders. However, the economic and administrative landscape had changed. The state was now a careful partnership between the crown and still powerful provincial governors. The resources for a 4th dynasty-style solid stone mountain were likely unavailable, or their concentration into a single project was politically unwise. The mud brick core was the ingenious solution. Construction technique, the skeletal framework. The builders of the Middle Kingdom pyramids at sites like Lisht, Dashur, and Ha'era developed a standardized, efficient method. 1. Stone skeleton. First, a grid of internal limestone walls was constructed, radiating from the center of the pyramid and crossing at right angles, creating a cellular structure. These walls were built with reasonable care, forming the load-bearing skeleton of the monument. 2. Mud brick and rubber infill. The compartments created by this stone grid were then packed with a mixture of sun-dried mud bricks, loose limestone. Chapter 45. The labyrinthine design of the Ha'era Pyramid Complex. The Pyramid of Amenemhat III at Ha'era, in the Fayum Oasis region, represents the final, Baroque phase of Middle Kingdom pyramid construction and one of the most audacious attempts to solve the eternal problem of the royal tomb. Security. While its superstructure followed the now standard mud brick core model, its subterranean plan was a radical departure. It was designed not just as a burial place, but as a defensive puzzle, an architectural trap meant to eternally confound tomb robbers. The classical historian Herodotus, who visited its sprawling mortuary temple centuries later, called that temple a labyrinth, surpassing even the pyramids in wonder. The term has clung to the entire complex, but it is the pyramid's own internal labyrinth that embodies a desperate, ingenious, and ultimately futile ingenuity. The external facade, conventional majesty. Externally, the Ha'era pyramid completed the shift to mudbrick core construction. Its casing of fine white Tura limestone would have given it the conventional, smooth, geometric form. Its location in the Fayum, a region developed extensively by Amenemhat III, signified the crown's investment in new agricultural lands. Nothing about its outer appearance hinted at the chaos within. The subterranean labyrinth, a diagram of paranoia. The burial apartment was accessed not from the north, the traditional direction, but from the south side of the pyramid, an initial deception. The entrance led to a vestibule and then to a seemingly blind end in the masonry. The true passage began from the ceiling of this chamber, a hidden switch leading into the labyrinth proper. What followed was a masterpiece of misdirection. The layout, as pieced together from early, destructive excavations and later surveys, featured false passages and dead ends. Corridors led enticingly only to terminate in blank walls of solid masonry. Sliding stone portcullises, massive slabs of chew. Chapter 46. The Second Intermediate Period. A list of ruling Hyksos dynasties. Following the relative stability and centralized power of the Middle Kingdom, Egypt fragmented once more during the Second Intermediate Period, circa 1650 to 1550 BCE. This era is defined politically by the loss of unified control and, most notably, by the rule of foreign dynasties in the north. These rulers, whom the Egyptians later termed Hyksos, from Haykau Kasut, rulers of foreign lands, governed from their capital at Avaris in the eastern Nile Delta. Our knowledge of this period is fragmentary, derived from scattered monuments, scarabs, and later, often hostile Egyptian accounts. The following is a list of the primary ruling dynasties of this time, a skeletal framework for an era of division and cultural interaction. The political landscape, a divided Egypt. The period was not a simple binary of Egyptians versus Hyksos. Power was split between at least three major poles. 1. The Hyksos 15th dynasty, ruling from Avaris in the Delta, controlling lower and parts of Middle Egypt. 2. The Theban 16th/17th dynasty, ruling from Thebes in Upper Egypt, initially as vassals or rivals to the Hyksos, later becoming the nucleus of resistance. 3. The Nubian kingdom of Kush, controlling Lower Nubia, sometimes in alliance with the Hyksos against Thebes. The Hyksos 15th dynasty, circa 1650 to 1550 BCE. This is the dynasty properly identified as Hyksos. Their origins are complex, likely stemming from a mix of Canaanite and other Levantine populations who had settled in the Delta during the Middle Kingdom, gradually attaining political control. They adopted Egyptian royal titulary and iconography but introduced significant technological and cultural innovations: the horse and chariot, new weapon types, the vertical loom, deities like Baal and Reshep. The known rulers in approximate order are 1. Seleucus or Sharuk, traditionally the founder who seized Memphis and established Hyksos rule. 2. Non, name known F. Chapter 47. The Theban Royal Necropolis. Advantages of the rocky terrain. The monumental shift from the conspicuous, freestanding pyramids of the Old and Middle Kingdoms to the hidden, rock-cut tombs of the New Kingdom represents one of the most profound strategic changes in royal burial practice. This transition found its ideal canvas in the stark, sun-baked cliffs on the west bank of the Nile at Thebes, modern Luxor, an area now known as the Valley of the Kings and the Valley of the Queens. The choice of this specific terrain was not arbitrary. It was a coldly calculated response to the chronic failure of pyramid security. The rocky, tortuous landscape of the Theban necropolis offered a suite of defensive, practical, and symbolic advantages that the open desert plateau could not match. The primary imperative, security through obscurity. After a millennia-long arms race with tomb robbers, a race culminating in the elaborate, failed labyrinths of the late Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom architects abandoned the concept of deterrence through mass. A pyramid, no matter how large or cleverly designed, was a giant signpost screaming "Royal Tomb here." The new strategy was concealment. The Theban cliffs provided the perfect medium for this. A tomb entrance could be cut high on a cliff face, in a remote, dry valley, a wadi, and then sealed and camouflaged with rubble. Unlike a smooth-sided pyramid, the natural, chaotic facade of the cliff offered no single, obvious point of entry. The tombs were spread across multiple, winding valleys, making systematic plundering more difficult. The terrain itself was a natural maze, deterring all but the most determined and well-informed robbers. Geological stability and workability. The Theban mountain is composed of Theban limestone, a thick, homogeneous stratum. This stone, while not as fine as the Tura limestone used for pyramid casings, had ideal properties for tomb construction.